Wasatch Foothills, Utah, September 1893. The air held the crisp, fragile promise of autumn, a promise that anyone who had survived a winter in these canyons knew was a lie. The sun was warm on the granite, but the wind carried a blade's edge from the high peaks. It was on this deceptive stage that Gareth Pryce was committing his folly. It wasn't a house he was building, not in any recognizable sense. He had spent 2 weeks with levers and rollers, coaxing a colossal 12-foot diameter riveted iron stock tank into a narrow gap between two immense granite outcrops. The thing looked like a giant's misplaced kettle, its curved black flank wedged tight against the pale, weathered stone. To the scattered community of settlers, it was an absurdity, a provocation against common sense. Otis Lankford, the very man who had sold Pryce the tank at a discount, leaned against the wheel of his wagon, arms crossed. He was the territorial agent for the Great Basin Iron Works, a man who knew more about stock tanks than any man alive. "I told you when you bought it, Pryce. This is for water, not for people. You're building a sweatbox for summer and an icebox for winter." Phineas Albright, a farmer whose cabin sat a half-mile down the creek, squinted at the scene. "It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. What's he think he's doing?" Lankford shook his head, a gesture of both pity and professional certainty. "He's building a coffin, Phineas. That iron will sweat with the least bit of warmth inside. His bedding will be soaked by November. The wool he's packing in there will turn to a rotten pulp. And when the real cold hits," he paused for effect, pointing a thick finger at the neat rows of rivets, "every one of those seams will pop. The frost will get into the iron, and it'll burst like a frozen gourd by February. It's pure madness." Gareth Pryce, a compact man with the quiet, deliberate movements of someone who has worked with heavy things his whole life, heard them. He gave no sign. He was meticulously fitting a timber frame for a door into the tank's open front, his hammer taps precise and economical. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply built. The mockery of the valley was just another kind of weather, to be endured until it passed. What did this Welsh slate quarry mason, a man from a land of damp hills and coal smoke, understand about thermal mass coupling that a professional stock tank salesman, an expert in the harsh realities of the high desert, had missed entirely? The answer to that question would not only save his family, but would rewrite a small but vital chapter in the story of survival on the American frontier. But first, there would be the mockery, the doubt, and the coming of a winter that would test every rivet and every assumption. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental physics of how ancient stone can defeat the most brutal cold, a principle that modern architects are only now rediscovering. Before we go on, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Gareth Pryce was not a carpenter. He had none of the intuitive feel for wood that his neighbors possessed, the casual artistry with an adze and draw knife that could turn a pile of logs into a tight, respectable cabin. He was not a farmer with a sense of the seasons ingrained in his bones. He was a creature of a different world, a world of stone and shadow. He was a CWT mason from the slate quarries of Blaenau Festiniog, Wales. His hands understood the heft of a slate slab, the grain of granite, the precise angle of a retaining wall, and the dry, radiant heat that came from the back wall of a shelter carved directly into the heart of a quarry. His tools were not saws and planes, but rock drills, feather wedges, and heavy hammers. His entire life had been a negotiation with rock. He had brought his wife, Ellen, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Reese and 7-year-old Bronwyn, to Utah for the promise of land and air that didn't taste of coal dust. They had arrived late the previous summer, and like all new settlers, they had thrown up a standard cabin, green logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a wide stone fireplace that consumed wood with terrifying speed. That first winter had been a lesson in failure. It hadn't just been cold, it had been a thief. It stole warmth, it stole comfort, it stole the very ability to function. Gareth would never forget the small, specific humiliations of that season. He remembered sitting down to write a letter home to his brother in Wales, only to feel the ink thicken and freeze in the nib of his pen mid-sentence. He remembered Ellen, her face a mask of frustration, when she went to feed her precious sourdough starter, a living thing carried all the way from the old country, and found it had frozen solid in its crock and cracked clean in half like a dropped plate. Most vividly, he remembered the sharp, brittle snap of his leather bootlaces one morning as he tried to tie them, the cold having leached every last bit of moisture and flexibility from them. They were small things, but they were symbols of a profound defeat. They were living in a shelter that could not shelter them. The children had spent 3 months huddled in their coats, their faces perpetually smudged with soot from a fire that seemed to heat a 3-foot circle around the hearth and nothing more. The problem, Gareth realized, wasn't the cold outside. The cold was a constant, a given. The problem was the house itself. It was a sieve. The conventional wisdom of the frontier was built on wood. A log cabin was a symbol of self-reliance, a structure wrestled from the wilderness with an axe and sweat. But in the bitter, dry cold of the Wasatch front, it was a flawed design. The logs, often felled and used green, would shrink as they dried over their first winter. Gaps would open, some as wide as a finger. The chinking, a mixture of mud, clay, and moss, would dry, crack, and fall out. Every seam, every joint, every corner was a potential entry point for the cold. The physics of its failure were relentless. The primary enemy was convection. The massive stone fireplace, while a source of radiant heat, was also a powerful engine for sucking warm air out of the cabin. It created a constant, imperceptible draft. Cold air, dense and heavy, would knife in through the 1,000 tiny gaps in the walls and floor. It would pool at floor level, chilling feet and legs, then be drawn towards the fire, warming slightly, rising, and immediately being pulled up the chimney and out into the night. Families like the Albrights were burning through a cord of wood every 10 days, a pace that was simply unsustainable. They were essentially trying to heat the entire state of Utah, one fireplace at a time. The second enemy was conduction. Wood is a relatively poor insulator compared to modern materials, and a solid 8-inch log wall had an R value of around 8. At 30 below zero, the interior surface of the log walls was often below freezing. This created the dreaded problem of interior frost. Any moisture in the air, from breathing, from cooking, from washing, would migrate to the coldest surfaces, where it would instantly condense and freeze into a thick, white lacework of rime. Bedding placed too close to a wall would be frozen stiff by morning. It was a damp, penetrating cold that no amount of fire seemed to touch. Gareth watched his neighbors fight this losing battle with more wood, more chinking, more blankets. He knew it was futile. They were fighting the design itself. He spent the spring sketching in a notebook, not pictures of cabins, but diagrams of heat flow. He thought of the CWT houses of his homeland, the small stone shelters built into the quarry face. A tiny fire of scrap wood could keep a dozen men warm inside, not because the fire was large, a Welsh quarryman's fire was famously small, but because the fire's heat was captured by the immense mass of the rock wall behind it. The rock became a battery for warmth, slowly releasing its stored energy for hours after the fire had died to embers. The problem here wasn't a lack of fuel. The problem was a lack of thermal mass. One day in late summer, he traveled to the railhead to see Otis Lankford. He didn't want lumber. He pointed to a massive, unsold 12-foot water tank, dented from a mishap during unloading. He paid $22 for it, half its listed price. Lankford was happy for the sale, but baffled by the purchase. What in God's name does a man with a creek 10 yards from his door need with a 1,200-gallon tank? Pryce? Gareth just smiled. I'm not building a cistern, Mr. Lankford. I'm building a home. The process of moving the tank was a monumental effort of leverage and patience. Pryce, with his quarryman's knowledge of physics, used long pine logs as levers and greased skids to inch the half-ton iron cylinder up the gentle slope to the 2 granite outcrops he had selected. The outcrops were perfect. One faced due south, a massive, flat-faced slab of granite that baked in the sun. The other, smaller and sharper, stood 12 feet away, perfectly positioned to shield the gap from the prevailing north wind. Once the tank was wedged firmly between the 2 rock faces, the real work began. This was where his neighbor's mockery turned to genuine concern for his sanity. He began lining the entire interior curve of the tank with a thick 6-inch layer of raw, greasy wool felt, purchased from a local sheep rancher. That's going to be a stinking rotten mess, Josiah Miller, another neighbor, observed one afternoon, watching Gareth painstakingly tack the heavy felt into place. The first warm day, that iron is going to weep, and that wool will be soaked. Otis Lankford, making a delivery nearby, stopped his wagon again. He felt a professional obligation to intervene. Pryce, he said, his voice earnest, listen to me. I sell these things. I know what they do. Condensation. It's called sweating. The temperature difference between the inside and outside will cover that iron in water. Your wool will be a sponge for mildew. You're building a plague house. Gareth paused, holding a strip of felt in place. He looked at Lankford, his eyes calm. The rock will be warm, he said, as if that explained everything. Then he turned back to his work. One quiet sentence. That was his only defense. Lankford threw his hands up in exasperation and walked away, muttering to Miller about the stubbornness of foreigners. He couldn't see the system. He only saw the object. His object, the stock tank, being misused in a way that violated every principle of its design. Next, Gareth built a heavily insulated wooden wall to enclose the front of the tank, with a small, well-fitted door and 2 small double-paned windows. He packed the wall cavity with sawdust from a local mill. Finally, he constructed a small, efficient cast-iron stove, setting it not in the middle of the space, but near the back, just a foot away from the massive granite rock face that formed the rear wall of his new home. He ran the stovepipe up and out through a carefully sealed flange in the iron roof. Ellen watched the whole process with a quiet trust that bordered on miraculous. She managed the children, cooked their meals over an open fire, and deflected the neighbors' pitying glances. One evening, as Gareth fitted the door, she stood beside him, a small smile on her face. "Well, Gareth," she said, her Welsh accent a soft melody against the harsh landscape. "Our neighbors live in log cabins. We shall live in a kettle. At least no one will accuse us of being dull." Rhys and Bronwyn were less certain. They saw the strange, curved black walls and the raw wool and missed the familiar, if cold, shape of their old cabin. But they trusted their father's hands. They had seen those hands split slate as thin as paper and set stones that would stand for 1,000 years. They knew he was not a foolish man. By late October, it was finished. The Pryce family moved their few possessions into the iron half-cylinder. The space was small, a single curved room, but it felt solid, protected. The air inside smelled of raw wool, fresh-cut pine, and the faint metallic tang of the iron. The mockery lasted through the autumn. The validation would last a lifetime. To understand why Gareth Pryce's iron home worked, you have to understand the failure of the conventional cabin. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was heat transfer. A frontier fireplace was a study in inefficiency, losing up to 90% of its heat straight up the chimney. The little warmth that did enter the room was in the form of infrared radiation, which only warmed the objects and people in its direct line of sight. The air itself remained stubbornly cold. This is why settlers complained of being scorched on one side and frozen on the other. Gareth's design tackled a different principle: thermal mass. He wasn't just heating a room, he was charging a battery made of stone. The key was the specific heat capacity of granite. A cubic foot of granite weighs about 168 pounds. It can absorb and hold a massive amount of thermal energy, roughly 3,400 BTUs, to raise its temperature by 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The granite outcrop forming the back wall of his shelter contained thousands of cubic feet. It was, for all practical purposes, an infinite heat sink. When Gareth lit a small fire in his efficient, airtight stove, the heat did two things. A small amount of it heated the air in the small, sealed space through convection. But the vast majority of the stove's energy, in the form of infrared radiation, streamed out and struck the massive granite wall just behind it. The stone began to drink the heat. For the first few days, the stove ran constantly, and the rock seemed to swallow the warmth without a trace. This was the charging phase. He was pouring tens of thousands of BTUs into the mountain itself. Otis Lankford's prediction about condensation, about the iron sweating, was based on sound physics, but a flawed premise. Condensation forms when warm, moist air comes into contact with a surface that is below the dew point. In a log cabin, the cold log walls were that surface. Lankford assumed the iron tank would be that surface. He was wrong. Because the iron tank was wedged directly against the granite, it was thermally coupled to the rock. As the granite absorbed heat from the stove, its temperature slowly rose. Through conduction, that heat flowed from the rock directly into the iron shell pressed against it. The iron itself became a warm surface. Instead of being a place for condensation to form, it became a massive, gentle radiator, broadcasting warmth evenly throughout the curved space. The shape was critical. A square room has cold corners, dead spots where air doesn't circulate and moisture collects. The tank's perfect curve eliminated these corners entirely, promoting a gentle, continuous circulation of warm, dry air. The 6 inches of wool felt insulation was the final piece of the puzzle. It prevented the heat that had been transferred to the iron from escaping out into the cold winter air. Its job wasn't to generate warmth, but to stop it from leaving. The entire structure was a one-way valve for heat. Energy flowed from the stove into the rock, from the rock into the iron, and from the iron into the living space. But it could not easily flow out through the insulated shell. Gareth had created a system. He didn't build a thin barrier to keep the cold out. He built a deep reservoir to hold the warmth in. He was heating the house with the mountain. The first test came in mid-November. A cold snap dropped the temperature to 0 for 3 nights. In the valley, smoke billowed from every chimney as families fed their ravenous fireplaces. Inside the tank, Gareth let the stove die down to a bed of coals after dinner. The air remained comfortable. In the morning, a thin skin of ice coated the water bucket, but the air was still, and the walls were dry to the touch. The rock was working. It was breathing warmth back into the room all night long. But the true test, the trial that would become legend, arrived in the second week of January. A warm Chinook wind had blown up from the south, melting the snow and turning the landscape to a brown, muddy mess. The temperature on the morning of January 12th was a baffling 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Settlers opened their doors, deceived by the false spring. Then came the Wasatch Canyon crash. Sometime after noon, the sky turned a bruised, metallic gray. The wind vanished, and an unnerving silence fell over the foothills. Then, the front hit. It didn't arrive, it struck. A wall of wind and ice particles descended from the high canyons, and the temperature began to plummet. It dropped 10 degrees in the first hour. By sunset, it was below zero and still falling. By midnight, the official reading at the railhead was minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It had dropped 80 degrees in 10 hours. The wind howled at over 50 miles per hour, driving a fine, stinging snow that was less like flakes and more like airborne sand. For the settlers in their log cabins, it was a night of terror. The wind found every crack, every shrunken seam. It blew snow through the walls. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, feeding their fires with a desperate intensity. The roar of the wind was matched only by the roar of the flames, devouring their precious woodpiles. Inside Gareth Pryce's iron home, there was silence. The smaller granite outcrop in front acted as a perfect windbreak, deflecting the main force of the gale over the top of the tank. The only sound was a low whistle from the stovepipe. The stove itself was burning low and steady, consuming a fraction of the wood his neighbors were using. The air was a comfortable 60 degrees. Bronwyn was asleep in her cot, and Rhys was reading a book by the light of a kerosene lamp. Ellen was humming softly as she worked. On a small table, she had a collection of jars. One of them contained the honey they had harvested from a bee tree the previous fall. As the wind howled its arctic fury outside, she picked up the jar. The honey, a deep amber, was perfectly liquid. She tilted the jar and poured a thin golden stream onto a piece of bread for Rhys. It flowed slowly, thickly, but it flowed. At that exact moment, in every other cabin in the valley, the honey in their crocks had crystallized into a solid, white, opaque mass, as hard and useless as stone. This small domestic act, the simple pouring of honey, was proof of a victory so complete it felt like a different reality. The cold hadn't just been held at bay, it had been rendered irrelevant. Otis Lankford was fighting for his livelihood. The 2 draft horses he used for his delivery routes, spooked by the sudden storm, had broken through their corral fence and bolted into the foothills. He'd spent the afternoon tracking them, and as the temperature crashed, his desperation mounted. Those horses were worth more than his wagon. He was bundled in every layer he owned, but the wind cut through him, and the cold was a physical pain. He found the trail leading up towards the granite ridges near Pryce's strange settlement. The snow was coming down so hard he could barely see 10 feet, a maelstrom of white. He stumbled, his snowshoe catching on a buried root, and pitched forward. He threw his Winchester rifle out to break his fall. The steel barrel struck something with a loud, metallic clang. He knew that sound. It was the sound of his own product. He had stumbled into Pryce's iron folly. His first thought was a curse on the Welshman's madness. His second was a flash of fear. He knew what happened to iron and steel at 30 below. It became brittle as glass. He scrambled to his feet, expecting to find the barrel of his expensive rifle cracked. He brushed the snow off the gun, and to his relief, it was intact. But the sound it had made, it was wrong. It wasn't the high-pitched, ringing crack of frozen steel. It was a dull, heavy thud, a sound with no resonance, as if the metal were dead. Puzzled and freezing, he reached out a bare hand to steady himself against the curved wall of the tank, instinctively bracing for the searing, flesh-welding pain of touching super-chilled metal. The contact was a shock, but not the one he expected. It wasn't cold. It was warm. He snatched his hand back in disbelief, then touched it again, more deliberately this time. The iron was not hot, not like a stove, but it was unmistakably, impossibly warm. He could feel a gentle stored heat radiating from it, a temperature perhaps just above freezing. He pressed his entire palm flat against the surface. The thick layer of crystalline rime that coated the iron melted instantly under his touch, leaving a perfect, dark, wet handprint on the curved steel. He stared at his handprint, a black mark against the ghostly white of the frost, and in that moment, the world tilted. Everything he knew, every professional certainty he held about iron and condensation and cold, dissolved into nonsense. This single sensory fact, a warm handprint in a blizzard at 30 below zero, was a more powerful argument than any words. Through the driving snow, he saw a faint, steady yellow light from one of the small windows. It wasn't the flickering, desperate light of a fire being fed for its life. It was the calm glow of a home. He stumbled to the door and knocked, his knuckles numb. Gareth Pryce opened it, and a wave of warm, dry air washed over Lankford, carrying the scent of baking bread. The stock tank salesman stared into the small, bright space. He saw the children, one reading, the other asleep. Neither of them in coats. He saw Ellen Pryce kneading dough on a flour-dusted board. He saw the small stove glowing with a gentle, restrained fire. And on the table, he saw the honey jar, its contents clear and golden. He thought of his own honey at home, a block of white crystal. Gareth looked at the half-frozen man on his doorstep. "You look lost, Mr. Lankford." Lankford could only shake his head, the frost in his beard crackling. He looked from the warm iron walls to the calm family to the tiny fire. He finally understood. "Pryce," he said, his voice hoarse with cold and awe. "You didn't build a shelter. You built a hearth inside a mountain." Otis Lankford did not find his horses that night. Gareth took him in, gave him a hot drink and a place by the stove, and in the morning helped him search. But Lankford had found something far more valuable, the humbling, liberating experience of being completely and utterly wrong. He became Gareth Pryce's most fervent advocate. The story of the warm handprint spread through the valley faster than gossip. Lankford, the expert, the professional skeptic, told it to everyone. He would take potential customers not to his warehouse, but up the hill to Pryce's tank. He'd have them place their own hands on the iron on a cold day. That was the only sales pitch he needed. By the following spring, 3 more families were planning similar structures, adapting the principle to their own locations. The mockery had vanished, replaced by a deep and quiet respect. The idea's biggest leap came a year later. A Union Pacific Railroad inspector named Davies was surveying a route for a new spur line through the canyons. His crews were plagued by the challenge of housing section hands, the men who would live in remote shacks and maintain the track through the brutal winters. The cost of supplying them with firewood or coal was astronomical. In a Salt Lake City saloon, he heard a wildly embellished story about a Welshman who lived in a water tank and heated his home with a candle. Intrigued, Davies rode out to the Wasatch foothills. He was not a man easily impressed, but Pryce's design struck him with the force of revelation. He saw not a curiosity, but a brilliant engineering solution. He spent 2 hours with Gareth, not talking, but measuring. He measured the distance from the stove to the rock, the thickness of the wool, the temperature gradient on the iron wall. He filled a notebook with sketches. In his final report to the UP headquarters in Omaha, he included a detailed schematic for a new standard section house design. It featured a small living space built against a rock cutting or a thick, earth-bermed stone wall. It was officially designated the Thermal Mass Shelter Type C, but the crews who built them, and lived warmly within them, called them Pryce Wedges. The quiet quarryman from Wales had, without intending to, influenced the very infrastructure of the West. His idea, born of ancient knowledge and personal hardship, was now being riveted into place, alongside the steel rails that were tying the continent together. The principles Gareth Pryce deployed out of necessity are the very same principles that drive the most advanced sustainable architecture today. We now have sophisticated terms for what he did: passive solar design, earth-sheltered construction, thermal mass energy storage. We use computer models to calculate the specific heat capacity of concrete and the R value of foam insulation, but the core concept is identical to the one Pryce understood in his bones. He knew that a thin wall, no matter how well sealed, is a temporary truce with the cold. A deep, massive wall is a permanent peace treaty. His home anticipated the energy-efficient building science of the 21st century by over 100 years, proving that the most elegant solutions are often found not in new materials, but in a deeper understanding of the ancient ones. In the end, the genius of Gareth Pryce's design was its profound humility. The other settlers saw the granite outcrops as obstacles to be built around, as a hostile part of the landscape to be defeated. They built their wooden fortresses against the wilderness, drawing a sharp line between the human and the natural. Gareth saw the rock not as an obstacle, but as an ally. He saw it as an unfinished wall waiting for a roof. He didn't build against the rock. He let the rock finish. The wall cold could never cross. He invited the mountain into his home, and in return the mountain held his family in its warm, stone heart through the longest nights of the year. It's a quiet lesson from a quiet man. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from resisting nature, but from knowing how to gracefully accept its help. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found this exploration of historical ingenuity as fascinating as we did, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. It helps us to continue bringing these forgotten histories to light. And let us know in the comments, what modern technologies do you think are just rediscovering ancient wisdom? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, while the technical principles and historical context are based on real practices. Any application of these or similar techniques should be undertaken in compliance with modern building codes, safety standards, and regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.